To minimize background noise, attendees have been placed on mute. Please rename yourself to include your name and affiliation if relevant in the participants panel. There will be opportunities for clarifying questions throughout the presentation, and in the latter half of the meeting will be dedicated to receiving substantive questions and comments. To ask a question or provide a comment, raise your hand. When it is your turn, we will notify you in the chat, announce your name, and unmute you and lower your hand so that you can speak. You can also put questions into the chat and I will read them if you'd prefer not to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. So you'll see the agenda on the slide. Our main focus for today's meeting is to provide an overview of mechanisms to address equity in the design of the Clean Heat Standard program. Addressing equity is a key issue and a priority for us as we continue to develop the Clean Heat Standard with your input. I want to note we want your feedback on the mechanisms presented in our stakeholder document and any additional ideas you may have. Before we get to that, we'll provide some updates on the Clean Heat Standard process. And as Josh said, we will leave plenty of time for your questions and comments after the presentation. Next slide. This slide shows our current stakeholder input process and our schedule. For our virtual community meetings, we will hold sessions every 4 to 6 weeks. And our next session in August will include a summary of the technical sessions that are coming up. And you see here the schedule for the upcoming technical sessions. I also want to note that we welcome your comments at any time, which can be sent to our Climate Strategies email, and that's climate.strategies@mass.gov. So I'll turn it now to Will.
Great, thanks, Christine. So thought we'd spend a few minutes just previewing the technical sessions we have scheduled for next week. These are subjects that were requested in written stakeholder comments for us to hold technical sessions. We're not intending to resolve all the details of the technical questions in these topics at these sessions, but rather just to present and explain some of the material related to these topics that we included in the discussion document, and also summarize what we heard in the public comment process, and then that would hopefully allow you all to think more about some additional, more detailed comments. So the three topics, the three meetings we've holding covering 6 topics. The first one will cover compliance, flexibility, and banking, and the related question of alternative compliance payment level. Alternative compliance payment is a type of flexibility mechanism. And the Tuesday session, we'll be looking at the calculation methods of credits for different technologies, including potentially hybrid heating system credits. I should note on this one, we're not going to spend much time on the question of which or how we would choose among the clean heat options or defined heats, but more technical issues associated with quantifying credits. And the third one, which may have a little bit less detail in it, is about an issue that's been raised somewhat in the comments about coordinating issue with the MassDEP program, and then somewhat related the issue of verifying clean heat measures. So those are sessions scheduled for next week, and we hope you'll join those if you're interested. But you also can wait for the next virtual community meeting when we'll try and summarize the basics of those and also post the recordings by then. Next slide. So this is a slide that we shared with you last time we met, just reminding you of what's on the Clean Heat Standard webpage, including the documents we've been talking about. There's several white papers on technical topics. There are asterisks here marking some things that we've added. One is we're continuing to try and help stakeholders understand the basic kind of question of what a clean heat standard is. So we've done that working with Regulatory Assistance Project, which authored an appendix to the climate plan last year. Before the last meeting, we posted a video presentation, just a short YouTube video explaining the basics of a clean heat standard. And since then, we've developed with them a 2-page summary that covers the same information. And that's intended particularly for translation. We don't quite have it translated yet, but we do intend to translate that into languages that are common in Massachusetts. We've also added slides and videos from the June virtual community meetings, and we plan to continue posting slides and videos from all the meetings online. And then finally, just to be clear, the registration for those technical sessions next week is also live on the webpage, and we hope to post the slides in the next few days. Next slide. So another slide we showed last time, just kind of previewing some of our next steps. The only thing new on this slide is that we've got some, we're going to raise some additional, or at least explain some information related to technical topics and also equity mechanisms in our sessions this week and next week. And we've got a question or two and thought it might be helpful. People have been asking, well, if I want to submit more information, when's a good time to do that? How's a good time to do that? So we have an open stakeholder process. There's no deadline. You could submit things anytime, but we would be helpful to get sort of a second round of comments if anything new comes up when you're listening to this session or the technical sessions, to get those by the end of August. And that sort of relates to the fourth bullet item on this list. We understand at some point we need to put out something a little more concrete for people to react to as far as the details of program design. And we'll use this initial round of information, including stuff we get from now through the end of August, in developing that. Just a reminder of a couple other next steps we mentioned last time. We're working on reporting regulations for fuel suppliers, and then also on an early action approach to crediting electrification projects. So that's the other sort of next steps we're working on. So next slide. So I'm going to turn it back over to Christine to introduce the next part of the meeting.
Thanks, Will. So as I said at the beginning, addressing equity in the clean heat standard is a priority for us as we design the program. And this meeting is really focusing on that, and you'll hear a little more detail on what we propose in the stakeholder document. But as I said earlier, we're very much interested in hearing other ideas that you may have as we go through the presentation. Please note what we have proposed, and at the end, please raise any additional ideas you have. And Will's going to go through our ideas, mechanisms we proposed, and then we'll finish up with the presentation and open it up for your comments and discussion. Go ahead, Will.
Great, thanks, Christine. Next slide. So we're going to be talking today about mechanisms for ensuring equity within a clean heat standard, and it's we understand a little hard to understand that without a basic understanding of what is the clean heat standard. So I'm going to spend a couple of times just talking through a little bit about what a clean heat standard is, and this is from a new slide from the two-page summary that I mentioned. The material is from the appendix to the climate plan, essentially, but we thought it might be helpful to just briefly talk through that. The clean heat standards, you can sort of think of as having sort of three components. There's a regulation. Sorry, I need to turn it on. I'm in a room that darkens if I don't move around a little bit, so solve that problem. So there's a regulation from DEP, which is essentially a requirement on heating energy providers. And that would be heating oil, propane, natural gas, perhaps electricity partly. And that requirement is to have them implement clean heat services, maybe not themselves, but through the mechanism of the clean heat standard, they would cause those services to be implemented at a particular rate or amount. There's options for meeting the standard, different clean heat options, and even within an example like heat pumps, there's options for where they would be installed, what types of homes are best for. Starting with that sort of thing. And it's important to understand that the clean heat standard doesn't require individual homeowners or businesses to make any particular choices. It simply supports the changes that are needed and makes sure that there's enough support to make the transition happen on the right pace. Next slide. So again, emphasizing the importance of sort of understanding what the clean heat standard is. I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but the previous explanation I gave didn't really explain what the concept of a clean heat credit is. So we said that the energy suppliers would need to implement clean heat measures, and that would be very hard to set in a standard because there's so many different kinds of clean heat measures, so many different places they can be put. So we need a way of sort of standardizing what that requirement is. So one of the basic parts of the clean heat standard is to take all the different kinds of clean heat that can happen, different places that electric heat pumps can be installed, potentially other types of clean heat, and sort of organize that into one basic concept as a clean heat credit, which sort of compares all the options and ensures that you're getting the greenhouse gas reductions amounts from the measures that are being installed. So the clean heat credits are what we use to implement the program, and the specific requirement is for the energy companies to purchase those credits, and that makes sure that the clean heat happens. Next slide. So we built into the stakeholder discussion document some discussion of some particular mechanisms or design features that could actually help equity within that basic concept of a clean heat standard. And before I get to saying what the particular mechanisms are, in the discussion document, we mentioned a couple of sort of basic concepts around equity that we would be looking at to benefit. One is that we identified three kind of groups that we would hope to benefit in an equity sort of an approach. One is low and moderate income consumers, another is renters, and another is communities that suffer from poor air quality. So the first two categories are categories where the economic considerations may pose challenges as far as implementing clean heat. And then the third category may have that issue, but also additionally poor air quality that makes them a particularly good target for moving away from fossil fuels. We also identified a couple of things that these mechanisms could do. They could simply support clean heat projects. So in other words, making new clean heat happen or transition to clean heat happen in one of these items listed in the first bullet there. But they could be used to provide some sort of ongoing support we raised in the discussion document also, so that if low-income customers are switching to electricity, somehow within the standard, we make sure that there's some ongoing support for their use of electricity and any costs associated with that. Next slide. So this slide is where it gets a little bit complicated. I'm going to talk through these fairly slowly, and then before we get to discussion, I'm going to pause after this slide and ask for any clarification questions about what these options kind of are. So in the discussion, and as Christine mentioned, we are interested in other options, and we will ask about that later in the presentation, but I want to start by presenting what we've already suggested to people. So there's three options that were discussed in the discussion document. One is that we would use what's called a carve-out approach, where we would say for whatever amount of credits that are required to achieve compliance in a year, we would say that some particular percentage, and half was the example we gave in the discussion document, would be used for something related to equity. One of those ideas on the previous slide for targeting. So that, we call that a carve-out approach, thinking about what carve-out is. Some of you that work in the equity field may have heard of Justice 40 in the federal government, which is sort of carving out 40% of benefits for equity. And this would be a similar kind of a concept when we say carve-out here, where we're taking a certain part of the program and making it a requirement. So that would essentially require that some amount of credits actually come from, deliver equity benefits in the program. So that's one of three ideas that we floated. The second one was what we call the just transition fee that relates to projects, particular projects. So one of the project types would be heat pumps installed in, say, residential homes. And we do want to encourage that kind of installation in all types of housing, but we might be able to take cases where the installations are occurring in housing that doesn't really address any of the equity outcomes, for example, a higher income community, and charge some sort of a registration fee on the crediting project, and then use those fees to support projects that do support equity outcomes. That's the second of 3 ideas that we mentioned in the stakeholder discussion document. The third was to explicitly dedicate alternative compliance payment revenue to addressing equity. Alternative compliance payments are a type of payment that happens when maybe there aren't enough credits available or not available at a low enough price, because maybe the standard is very stringent in a particular year. We anticipate, and some stakeholders supported, adding an option to make a payment instead. And so this option would require that revenue goes to address equity. But we did note a caveat in the discussion document: alternative compliance payments may not happen. They are an alternative. So if compliance with the standard is happening normally, you might not get much funding for that. Now, of course, you might not need it as much because you might be achieving the equity requirements and everything else, but that's something to keep in mind with that option. And then the other thing we noted, and I would note now, is that there's not necessarily a need to choose between those options. They're all compatible with one another. You could include more than one in a program. Maybe I should pause briefly and just make sure Christine or Deneen, or there's not anything that I missed or should have added. And then if we go on to the next slide, I think we're going to pause for a minute once we've gotten past that for any clarification questions on what I've presented so far. So we will have time, more open-ended discussion later, but if there's a clarification, either Josh that you see in the chat or from our participants, that would be fine.
Did you have a comment?
Yes, actually. I was wondering how you may choose to identify who would qualify for a just transition fee.
Yeah, that is one of the questions in general that I think we're looking for more input on. We did identify that there are sort of 3 separate examples I mentioned earlier in the slide broadly. You know, renters may have difficulty accessing clean heat, LMI, low medium income consumers, and also communities impacted by air pollution. But we're very much interested in general, and we'll be working in more detail on how we would be more specific than that. So but those are the basic, what we've identified so far.
Then we have a question from the chat from Tim Johnson. With a rollout of a program of this magnitude, why haven't all fuel and gas dealers been notified? It seems only a few are aware of this when I ask others. If they are to be the ones tracking and implementing this program, shouldn't all the players be notified of this sweeping change?
So I think we're going to put that one off because it's not really to the topic. We certainly have made an effort to notify anyone, and we're happy to have people tell us other groups we might conduct outreach to. But we want to focus on the equity mechanisms, I think, here.
Just on that point, the commenter, it is an issue that I think we do want to hear from you. Is there a list of folks that we could utilize to get the word out? We've been doing a lot of outreach. It happened through the Clean Heat Commission. We're doing that. We have a very large stakeholder list. But if you have additional folks or a mechanism to get the word out, as well said, please send it along to us and let us know.
We did also cover a little bit in the last virtual community meeting. If you want to look at it online, the work we're doing to further refine our list of regulated entities. We did an update on that last time, so that's posted online as a video.
We have another question from Rashiaki of Agrid Energy. Would this program replace the APS program?
So that's another question that's not fully decided. That possibility has definitely been raised by the discussion document, also the Clean Heat Commission. But I do want to say that just triage a little bit and get the focus on questions on the equity mechanisms that were raised in the discussion document.
A question from Sophia Owen. How are you defining places with poor air quality?
Right, I think we aren't yet reaching the point of making those kinds of decisions. At this point, we're looking for input on whether that's one of the right places to target the equity provisions, and then we'd have to go into more detail about that. So we'll be working on that later on. Maybe I should say that I think the straw proposal phase that I mentioned is where we might get a little more specific about that sort of thing. So input would be very much appreciated over the next couple months about that topic.
We have a question from Stephen Chase. Are renewable fuels, i.e. biofuel and renewable propane, given credits in this program?
I think maybe we should triage a little bit and identify that as not a question about the equity mechanisms and put it in a parking lot maybe for the end of the meeting. Christine, what do you think about that idea?
Yes, I agree with that. I think we do want to get to all the issues on equity, and to the extent time allows, we can go back to the triage questions. But we don't want to cut off comments by any means, but we do want to focus on the equity stuff this morning.
I'm not seeing any additional raised hands or questions in the chat right now.
Okay, so just to bring the focus back here, the purpose of the first part of it, we're going to be talking a little bit more general terms and a little more opportunity for open discussion about equity mechanisms. And I wanted to start that by, making sure that what's already been said by us in our discussion document was understood and clear. Next, we're going to move on a little bit to talk about what we've heard related to equity, and then open it up a little bit more for input from you all. So next slide.
One late comment. Would dairy digesters and host farmers be included under the equity programs?
So that's an interesting, that's why don't Josh, if you can help me remember to address that later on, because I think that fits well with the next couple of slides I'm going to get to. We did not raise that possibility in the discussion document.
Sure, I'll bring that up.
Thanks. So we did ask some specific questions in the discussion document. And one is whether a carve out is a good approach, and how would we determine the specific amount for the carve out? Should the revenue be used to fund new clean heat, or would it be appropriate to do some ongoing support for customers who need ongoing support? And then finally, how should we define and identify credits to support equitable outcomes? And we had a question about that for us a minute ago. So next slide. So it's always hard to summarize comments because there's so much variety, but we can bring in a little bit of flavor of what we heard here in looking at the hundreds of pages of comments we got. We noticed there was quite a bit of support for the carve-out approach as an equity mechanism, and also for making sure equity ACP revenue was used for equity-related purposes. We heard less comments in favor of a just transition fee, and also in the use of credit. We also heard something we didn't raise, which was the idea of credit multipliers. I think the idea is something, for example, a project that was in a community affected by air pollution might get like double credit or something like that. So that's an additional idea that came up in the comments that we'll keep on the list of things we're thinking about, but it didn't get wasn't mentioned by a lot of comments. We also got a lot of comments on the use of revenue, which really were focused on the low and middle income households. And I think that's kind of the focus we heard, but we did hear about affordable housing, which is certainly related. Also supporting renewable thermal technologies and basic bill assistance as a way to help consumers. So that's the bulk of my presentation. Overall, this, as Christine mentioned, is the question of whether we're missing something, if there's options that we haven't heard about yet, and also whether there are additional comments you'd make about these ideas, either how we should consider them, what additional work we should do, or particular support or opposition or anything. So I think we could go ahead to the next slide.
Just briefly, there's two questions that may be related to this slide. From
Sure.
Cole Martin, Argus Media. Can you clarify what you mean by ongoing support to LMI customers? Could that take the form of energy bill assistance, which I believe you just mentioned?
Yes, it could be any sort of assistance. It might be targeted at customers that have made a switch to an electric heat pump and therefore, maybe paying costs associated with operating the heat pump, but it also raised the possibility that it could possibly be even more broad than that. And bill assistance, as Josh mentioned, is listed here as a possibility.
And then from Caitlin Peel Sloan, 36 organizations signed on to our comments in support of the just transition fee. So just a comment there.
That's a helpful clarification. As I said, we do have a challenge when we try and summarize things. I think we did hear more approach for the equity carve out and ACP, but that's helpful to have you clarify that's we should put that under many. So that's helpful, Caitlin. So at this point, I think we're open for general comments and questions. I think Josh, if you could reread that comment that I kind of put off, because I think it gets at something we hadn't really looked at too much. The one about the dairy farm question, I think.
Sure. So Rashiaki asks, would dairy digesters and host farmers be included under the equity programs?
Yeah, so I think it depends on, that's not, I guess that might be categorized as sort of a new idea. It's not directly related to some of the examples that we talked about, but to the extent that there are industries that need support also, that's something we'd be happy to hear about as a comment. As I said, it is helpful if you have ideas, not necessary, but helpful to get them in writing. So if you have a particular concept in mind, we'd be happy to hear more about that.
Caitlin, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Will and Christine, for the presentation today. I just wanted to kick off the comments by reiterating the importance of both helping direct measures to folks who may find it harder to make a switch under their own means, but also to do that direct energy bill assistance so that folks who have been historically underserved by programs like MassSAVE, which are very similar, can have help with rising energy costs regardless. And for me, that really underscores the importance of an alternative compliance payment and not allowing alternative combustion fuels, so that if an obligated party isn't ready or isn't able to find an electrification option, they can pay in to the fund, and that money can be directed to equity priorities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would now be a good time to bounce back to the question about renewable credits for propane and biofuel?
I think so. If they're equity related, it would be good to kind of triage things that have a clear equity connection embedded in the question, I think, but.
From Tim Johnson, equity, is it equity of energy source? Meaning if electricity is not of the renewable source being utilized, will that be on the same level as natural gas? Since most is derived from natural gas at this point in time. Will electricity be penalized for not being derived from a clean energy source? How will that work? It should be equitable across the board for all energy providers.
So the way that equity is defined for purpose of this discussion is consistent with sort of the discussions that have been going on about equity and environmental justice in a variety of forums, including a lot related to environmental impacts and also economic impacts. So that really does get at things that affect individual consumers and citizens that may have disadvantaged economically, and does not, for purposes of this discussion, is not about sort of equitable treatment of different technologies or heating sources. Those are questions that we'll need to deal with at some point, but that's not the focus of this discussion.
And I will just add, in response to the question, there will be conversations, and we are asking for input on what types of heat will qualify for clean heat credit. So that is a separate and distinct issue from equity, as Will mentioned.
Yeah, I could add that the question of how we would calculate credits is the topic of one of the technical sessions we have scheduled for next week.
I see a couple of questions about the legislative process, the discussion about a clean heat standard at the legislature. We will bring that back to our legislative liaison and get more information from her. Her name is Courtney Rainey, about what's going on there, and make sure that we have we can plug into that discussion as needed.
A question from Christopher Chase. How do you plan on regulating out-of-state dealers who may only deliver fuel into Massachusetts but have limited resources to install heat pumps, weatherization to a Massachusetts consumer, especially to low and moderate income mass consumers?
Well, I think there's sort of two separate questions there. The question about regulating the out-of-state dealers is kind of embedded in, we've proposed a reporting requirement in quite a bit of detail. I shouldn't say proposed, but put straw regulatory language that we haven't gotten a lot of detailed comment on. But we would, I think, to the extent that the question is about equity, we think that probably we're going to be looking more at the low income and moderate income consumers that you mentioned, and looking at it from their standpoint versus the dealer delivering from out of state as the target of our equity programs.
Follow-up from Rashi Aki. Dairy digesters that take in food waste reduce greenhouse gases significantly. Would the heat produced and extend the GHG reduction be linked? Dairy farming sector is typically economically stressed sector. It would be great to get that sector to be supported by equity programs, as there is significant opportunity to reduce greenhouse gases.
Right, so there's two separate issues there. One is, to what extent are those facilities eligible for credits, and that's a question for next week and even further in the future. There's a separate question about whether those are identified sort of separately as as an equity targeted sort of a thing, and that, as I said, we are mostly in this presentation talking about equity as something that applies at the consumer and the citizen level, and not so much at the business or industry level. But we are listening and taking down all of your comments, so they're all appreciated.
Go ahead, Dean.
Thank you. Thanks for this important and very informative meeting this morning, both Will and Christine. Just wanted to go back to Sophia Owens's question and ask if you are seeking input from EJ stakeholders about certain communities that have poor air quality, and if yes, are you thinking about a scoring of those communities, or have you put any thought into how you would look at those communities that would be identified as having poor air quality? Thanks.
Thanks, Deneen, for raising that. Yes, we are thinking about it. I will just mention the process that we're going through on the cumulative impact analysis regulations that we propose. We have a process that we're requiring a cumulative impact analysis in or around EJ areas, and we're using a number of different factors as a bit of a surrogate for poor air quality. That's one option. But we do have, a network of air quality monitors throughout the state. Well, we could look at that too, but we have not made any decisions. So I know some folks on the call may have been involved in the CIA process. We've posted a number of documents there. We will be requiring people who apply for an air permit to look at various indicators, some of which are very much related to poor air quality. So that's one area for our exploration.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other raised hands or questions in the. Oh, a bunch just came in. Dylan Patel, could you use EJ screen for poor air quality identification?
I think that's the kind of suggestion that we're, looking for, and I think we will be looking at that sort of thing in quite a bit more detail as we think about this. I think at this point we're really looking for broader input on, should air quality, should we try and do that, and which equity mechanisms should we use to support it, and then we would start looking at a more technical level on how to do that. So that's very helpful to have you raise that, and if people have detailed ideas about this, we're happy to hear about that in the next month or two.
Question from Michael Ferrante. Is MassDEP working with state officials who run the heated fuel assistance program to coordinate equity issues?
We are in touch with our Department of Energy resources on that, on the program. So yes, in that sense. Again, I should stress, we haven't gotten into a lot of details yet, so we certainly would do more of that coordination as we move forward with this work.
Question from Raymond Albrecht. The EPA AVERT computer model and historical ISO New England grid load data can be used in hourly forecasts of increased peaker operation in LMI neighborhoods due to electrification, especially if heat pump and EV charging loads increase more quickly than wind and solar power generation. Why would MassDEP be open to a cooperative effort to analyze the hourly emissions impact of the clean heat standard?
So I think to relate this to the equity discussion, there's this question about lower and middle income customers and neighborhoods that may be affected by air quality, and there's a lot of contemplated science around that. I think the thinking thus far has been that the program would deal with that by trying to deal with emissions from fossil-based heating within those neighborhoods, and that the state has many other programs to deal with cleaning up the electricity supply, including procurement programs around clean energy, and then explicitly the clean peak standard that Department of Energy Resources operates is intended to help address some of those particular issues around timing of emissions. So it is something we are definitely have our eyes on, but not something that we particularly are thinking right now of looking at in the clean heat standard. Having said that, we're obviously open, as I've said a number of times, on comments on any issue, and we do have written comments on that topic that we are looking at.
Question from Sophia Owen. Is the possibility of a trading program for credits still being contemplated?
Yeah, I think the thinking right now is that there would be a trading program for credits. That's the really only way we know of to implement a quantitative requirement. So the problem the Clean Heat Standard is trying to solve is that under our climate plan, we need to get a particular amount of clean heat and particular amounts of reductions. And these kind of trading programs that require the purchase of credits seem to really only be able to function with trading of credits. So that would be part of the program. And that's related to the alternative compliance payment concept because it allows the option of making a payment that could be used for a similar purpose instead of purchasing credits.
Question from Leslie Anderson.
I guess actually if I could just say one other thing about, so one of the things that the credit, the carve out concept would do is make sure that whatever trading went on, it wouldn't, you might find if you didn't have something like that, that the market would find that it wasn't cheapest to do the reductions that are needed in the communities or with the customers that we identified. And so the point of the carve out, for example, would say that in the market, you have to purchase a certain amount of credits that we would somehow have identified as meeting those qualifications. And so while there would be a market for credits, it wouldn't necessarily allow, it would still include, if we went with that option, which some stakeholders have supported, it would have a way of making sure that there is an equity component within that. But as I've said, we're open for comments on all aspects of the program.
Great. Question from Leslie Anderson. Is MassDEP only looking at Massachusetts equity issues, or will you also be considering equity issues related to battery mining and some of the worst environmental justice locations across the globe?
So we're happy with comments on any subject. The purpose of the focus of this particular meeting is to, we think that we've floated some ideas that get at some particular aspects of equity that are of particular interest to communities within Massachusetts. And so we're interested in feedback in this particular meeting on those subjects, but we're in general happy to receive comment on broader questions. And I'm happy to have Christine or Deneen add or subtract from that if you have thoughts about it.
No, I think we've indicated that, you know, we do want to focus on the equity measures we want to incorporate into the program, but as Will said, we are open to all input. The battery mining, that issue certainly has come up in the context of electric vehicle, the transition to electric vehicles. So we certainly are hearing about that.
Question from Thomas O'Rourke. Has the Commonwealth determined air source heat pumps are a cost-effective alternative for a clean heat standard source versus other system? With LMI customers, the operating cost may be excessive or require substantial subsidies.
So we have a mandate from the 2 climate plans and also a strong support from the Clean Heat Standard to focus on electrification as something that's necessary by 2050. We've indicated our awareness of the concern about operating costs in that we floated as one of the ideas that we would target for equity, some support for those operating costs. So I think that's, you know, I think the kind of thing we're looking for now is that a viable or a good way of addressing that issue. The climate planning process really made clear that we do need to move toward electrification in order to meet our in order to meet our electrification goals. So we're not sort of revisiting that question.
As a reminder, if you'd like to speak, use the raise hand function and we can unmute you to speak. Question from Chris Brennan, Ideal Energy Cooperative. Can you point me to a resource or internal study or a specific tech session that will develop an estimate of dollars per household impact on mass customers of this policy implementation. Since we are talking equity, I would consider this calculation to be critical in determining total economic effect on an LMI household.
Right, so we don't have that now. We do have a little bit of a start on that in one of the memos that we have posted online. And we have, it's clearly identified that as one of the things that we're looking at building into the program to address as an equity issue, the ongoing costs in low-income customers. We do also in the discussion document identify the need to do more economic analysis and ask for input on economic analysis. And certainly that analysis will need to happen and need to focus on low and moderate income customers. So I don't have anything to point you to now, but we do acknowledge the need to do more work on that.
Question from Jim Blake. What is your timeline for implementation?
So we don't have anything at this point other than the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050 identified as early as 24 as the implementation schedule. We don't anticipate having the full program in place by the beginning of 2024, but we hope to have some of it, or we may have some of it in place by the heating season at the end of 2024 into 2025. We have a couple components that we're hoping to move more quickly that we've already signaled: the reporting requirements, the mission reporting requirements that will underlie the compliance obligation, and also the electrification crediting mechanism.
A question from Rashi Aki. Since non-EV transportation sector impacts air quality directly, would there be support for EV vehicles as well as converting our grid to renewable? This would support EJ communities, especially ones where traffic congestion is high.
Yeah, so this is a clean heat standard. So we have a lot of issues to figure out within the clean heat standard. So that's probably not one that's going to end up playing out in this particular program, but it's certainly an issue that's more broadly of interest.
Right, and just to add there are a number of programs and policies in the Commonwealth that do address the transportation sector and decarbonizing the transportation sector, particularly movement towards electric vehicles. So we have incentive programs and regulatory programs, and that definitely does improve air quality as we transition those vehicles to EVs. But there are consumer rebates. I know that there's some discussion about the low income rebate going on.
No additional hands or questions right now.
While we're waiting, I'll just make one comment. I think we did have a question about outreach to stakeholders. We're still in an initial stakeholder input period. We have made, as Christine mentioned, some efforts to get the word out, including to our environmental justice coordinator and our office and our stakeholder list, which includes a couple thousand emails, and then also to using postcards to the potentially affected regulated communities. But we're very much interested in making sure that we can hear from anybody that wants to hear about this particular these equity issues. So there is a link on the website where you can sign up for the stakeholder list. The website is easy to find with the search MassDEP Clean Heat Standard. We encourage people to help us identify and get the word out. We do want to hear from everybody. Right, maybe we're all set. Christine, do you think?
Yeah, I think this has been helpful and I appreciate all the comments. We will be back again this evening at 6 p.m. So the meeting will be pretty much the same, but I'm happy to have anyone back. Not the sessions will be posted online, and the recordings online. And thank you very much for your input and attending. So we'll wait another minute or so and then we'll end the meeting.
Josh, I think you can cut us off at this point. Thank you.